on to this story now. Food inflation remains stubbornly high in South Africa, with the most vulnerable consumers now spending up to 40% of their income on food. That's according to the Competition Commission's chief economist, James Hodge, on the sidelines of the 17th Annual Competition Conference in Fourways, Johannesburg. Here's what Ntokozo Khumalo filed when he spoke to Hodge.
The 17th Annual Competition Conference looks to explore ways that South Africa can fast-track moving towards competitive markets, transformation and deconcentration. And the Competition Commission has, released various reports looking at anti-competitive behavior. And one of the key focus areas this year has been the rising food price inflation. And to talk us through that is James Hodge, who is the chief economist with the Commission. Thank you so much, James, for talking to us. Now, one very important area of focus from the Commission's work this year has been around food price inflation, as consumers obviously under immense pressure. Talk us through what has been the trends that the Commission has been seeing over the last year or so.
Well, actually, since COVID, there's been increased inflation in food to astronomical levels. So since the beginning of the pandemic happened, food prices are up almost 35%. But worse still, it's for your zero-rated staples that hit the poor the most. So things like cooking oil up over 50%, things like vegetables, bread, maize meal, all above average even for food inflation. And so what we've seen is for the poorest households, 40% of their income is spent on food, which means the effect is phenomenal. At the highest end is 5%. They're not as badly affected. So this is a critical issue at a critical time when people really are struggling in the economy. And so that is something we have to look at. What we have seen is we are subject to a lot of global shocks. So obviously the pandemic, supply chain. We also saw then a lot of climate change events that have caused droughts or floods that have damaged global crops. So that's why it's almost persisted and been ongoing. And then, of course, fertilizer, oil, all of those shocks from the Ukraine war. But we are finding it's exacerbated. So whilst that might be the underlying push, it is exacerbated by concentrated markets we have in South Africa for food, processing, retail, but also your inputs, but also regionally and globally. And what this conference also highlighted, bringing in people that have a regional and global perspective, is that it isn't just our own market, it is a regional and global impact on concentration. So efforts around making these markets more competitive, which means these shocks maybe have less impact, they're not as wild as we've seen, requires not just South African enforcement efforts, but continental and global efforts, through BRICS and other forums as well.
And just, James, quickly interjecting there, when you investigate that value chain as you conduct those reports saying that there's that concentration, what kind of concentration does it then point to, particularly when it comes to, food prices?
Well, you've got a lot of concentration at your inputs, and that is a global one. So your producers of fertilizer, seeds, your pesticides, herbicides. And high concentration there means that you're not necessarily getting a competitive market outcome. You could see higher prices than normal. And that just affects the economics of farming and how much we can produce, because the prices may be set in the market. And so that's one element. The second element is as we move from the farm gate, and this is something we're seeing globally, that in a high inflation environment, people expect to see a price increase because they're told there's a war in Ukraine and there's this global event. But there's no transparency as to how much that price increase should go up because of costs. And so firms are passing through sometimes more than they should and shielding themselves from the negative effects of this uncertain time. But that's not helping consumers. So it may be one thing that, we found, for instance, the retail groups have managed to maintain their profitability throughout this period, but you can't say that for low-income households. And so there is an imbalance here that we need to also look at domestically. And sometimes it's processes that push up price on the back of a Ukraine war, but our own costs are not going up. And that we don't think is acceptable. And then at the retail level, they can be slow to drop the price when they've seen the costs come down. So we're entering a period where it seems food inflation is starting to decline. But our latest report, which came out last month, shows that, in fact, that started at the beginning of the year in the commodity markets. It hasn't fed through yet to the consumer.
James, so a lot to still really dig into in terms of what's happening in that space. And of course, that's James Hodge, who is the chief economist at the Competition Commission, talking us through just the reports that they've worked on in this year, particularly the food price inflation that has certainly put consumers under pressure. And we will be digging into the issues that farmers and auction houses and retailers have faced when it comes to just pricing that food so that the most vulnerable in the economy are not as affected by those rising prices. For Newzroom Afrika on channel 405, I'm Ntokozo Khumalo in Fourways, Johannesburg.